On September 26, 2012, in a small hotel room in Liberia, three men sat around a table, preparing to close the deal of a lifetime. Inside the room, they talk business worth millions. But something is not right. This isn't just another deal. It's a ticking time bomb disguised as business. This meeting was never supposed to happen. They don't know it yet, but they are on the radar. Someone is watching them for months. No, they didn't realize that every move they made was being tracked. Every text, every deal. It was all part of a much bigger plan. One that had been quietly building for years. And in the shadows, hidden from sight, there's one name on the line. Paul LaRue, a man who is the mastermind of a global criminal empire. He's the ghost behind the scenes. He is pulling strings, managing everything, and no one knows who he is. No one has ever seen his face. But they all know his influence. But what was this empire, and who was watching them the entire time? Well, this video will reveal it all, but before jumping into it, it's important to know, who was Paul LaRue?
Dark side.
To most people, Paul LaRue didn't look like the kind of man who would ever be tied to a global crime syndicate. He wasn't a thug, he wasn't a gangster, or someone with a criminal past. He was a programmer. He was like a man who could sit in front of a computer for hours and create things that most people couldn't even imagine. He was brilliant, self-taught, and had a mind for systems. Systems that could be used for good, but also for evil. Born in South Africa, Paul showed an early interest in computers. By his teenage years, he had already taught himself programming. Paul was quickly mastering the complexities of the digital world. But unlike most tech-savvy kids who dreamed of building apps or websites, Paul had bigger ambitions. He was not really interested in making money through legal means. His eyes were on something much darker. He wanted to use his skills to build an empire, a criminal empire. So Paul moved to the Philippines in the late 1990s, a place where he could work in peace. The location was perfect, the government was corrupt, the borders were quite weak, and the customs officers were easy to bribe. No one would notice if he operated quietly in the background. Well, what Paul created was both simple and brilliant. He started with an online pharmacy, a seemingly harmless business. He sold prescription drugs to people who couldn't get them legally. But he wasn't just selling pills, he was setting the stage for something far more dangerous. He saw the gaps in the system. He saw how easy it was to hide in plain sight, and soon, he did something unbelievable. Now, he wasn't just selling drugs. Paul also started importing weapons, moving cocaine, and smuggling money. He did all of this while hiding behind layers of encryption, offshore networks, and identities that didn't exist. In fact, he didn't even need to be physically present everywhere. He didn't have to meet anyone face to face, because he could control it all from behind his screen. Paul LaRue was a ghost, one who used technology to stay invisible yet incredibly powerful. It didn't matter how risky it was. Paul was good with computers. No one could trace him and no one could find him. He recruited a network of people who worked for him. Dealers, smugglers, hackers. That's how he built his empire from the ground up. He wasn't really hiding in the shadows, he was everywhere. But it wasn't just the wealth that made Paul dangerous. It was how he used his mind to stay ahead of the law. He had the perfect setup. There was no paper trail, no physical evidence, just lines of code that made everything disappear. But how did he make it so big? What was the secret behind this face of a programmer? And how did it turn into a massive global criminal empire? Paul LaRue wasn't really satisfied with the small operations he had started. What began as a simple online pharmacy selling prescription pills grew into something much larger. It didn't take long before Paul expanded his reach into the world of drugs, arms, and even human trafficking. His setup was airtight. He had encrypted networks, ghost identities, offshore vaults, and every trace was erased way before it could be found. But as his empire grew, so did the risks lingering over his head. Paul wasn't just looking to make money, he wanted power, he wanted control, and that's why he turned his operation into the backbone of a global criminal network. His skills as a programmer weren't just helping him evade the law, they were making him unstoppable. They were enabling him to run a multi-billion-dollar operation without getting his hands dirty. Paul's operation spread to several countries. the Philippines became a key hub for his illegal activities, with call centers popping up around the country. He moved his business from one country to another, hiding behind fake companies and fake names. On the surface, all of his businesses looked separate. One sold medicines, another moved weapons. But behind the scenes, they were all connected. They were all feeding the same machine. And at the center was Paul, controlling everything and pulling every string of the empire. But no matter how well you hide, mistakes can happen. But as Paul's empire grew, so did his ego. He had once been a tech nerd, sitting behind a computer, coding and making money in ways no one could see. But now he was a criminal mastermind, and he started to live like one. Luxury cars, big mansions with ocean views, and endless parties. Paul was drowning in more illegal money than he knew what to do with. It was easy to get lost in this new world. But Paul's rising fame and wealth were starting to attract attention, both from law enforcement and from people within his organization. The people around him weren't as loyal as they once seemed. It started with small mistakes. A courier who didn't follow instructions properly. A shipment that didn't arrive where it was supposed to. It was nothing major at first, but as Paul's network expanded, so did the chances for things to go wrong. And it seems LaRue's empire wasn't as invisible as he thought. Despite all his precautions, law enforcement was catching up. The DEA had been tracking him for years. They were slowly stitching together the puzzle of his global operation. There was the online pharmacy, the weapons trafficking, the money laundering. It all connected back to Paul. But it wasn't until 2008 that the DEA made a breakthrough. A tip-off from a bank in Hong Kong led investigators to a network of suspicious transfers between various LaRue-connected companies. This was the first tangible link that could directly connect Paul to the illegal activities. They had been following a web of companies from the United States to Panama to the Netherlands, and now they finally had a lead. Paul's network, however, wasn't just operating in the shadows. The money trails led to LaRue's many shell companies, names like Southern Ace, La Plata Trading, Martenius Trading, and Vishnu Limited. They were all connected to Paul's growing empire. These companies were set up in different countries to hide the true scale of his operations. And it worked for a while, but now the authorities had a glimpse of the whole operation. They knew about his call centers in the Philippines. They knew about his investments in gold and timber in Africa. Authorities also got to know about his yacht. It was a 115-foot giant called the Texas Star II. Paul used it to move drugs and weapons across the globe, quietly and efficiently. That is, until it wasn't so quiet anymore. Paul thought he was untouchable. He had been careful, using encryption and offshore accounts to hide his tracks. But the moment the DEA had their first solid lead, they were in motion. They traced everything back to him. His businesses, his employees, his deals, and his escape routes. The investigation had begun, and there was no turning back. Paul was on the move, but the authorities were just getting started. In 2011, Paul LaRue's empire was massive. He was living a double life. On one hand, he was the genius programmer who built online pharmacies and high-tech operations. On the other, he was deeply involved in illegal activities. Yet, despite his empire spanning across continents, one thing was clear. Paul needed to hide. He was growing paranoid. The authorities were closing in on him. He needed to move again. So Paul made a bold move. He packed up and moved to Brazil, a country where he already had fake businesses, shell companies, fake fronts. Basically, Brazil had everything he needed to disappear. Again, it was the perfect place for him to stay off the radar. But Paul didn't stop his operations. He created another company, Rainbow Force Technologies, which he used to launder money and keep his illegal businesses going. He had access to secret locations, money, and, most importantly, a network that could cover up his tracks. But even in Brazil, Paul wasn't safe. The heat was increasing, and mistakes from his associates started catching up to him. By 2012, Paul was moving fast, but so were the law enforcement agencies chasing him. His once foolproof operation was beginning to show cracks. Paul's empire had grown so big that even he couldn't manage it all. From online pharmacies to moving large amounts of methamphetamine, his crimes were vast. And now, authorities from around the world, DEA, Interpol, Europol, they all had started piecing together the puzzle. But it was one of Paul's associates, Shai Reuven, who unknowingly started the chain reaction. Reuven was caught in the act of making illegal deals. He revealed key details that law enforcement had been hunting for years. This allowed them to connect the dots back to Paul, and from there, everything began to unravel. Paul was on the move again, but this time he was bouncing between Brazil and various other countries. But every step he took, the law was right behind him. His paranoia grew. He had to keep moving and stay in control. But the running came at a cost. Every move made his empire weaker. It made it less stable and more exposed. The authorities were gaining on him, and the empire he built began to feel like a house of cards. In 2012, Ronald Baraquatro, a man Paul trusted, was caught for a small crime. He was caught by the police for stealing a motorcycle in the Philippines. But when police searched his bag, they found far more than a stolen bike. They discovered fake IDs, burner phones, and, most importantly, a stack of papers containing details about Paul's criminal empire. The authorities now had the key they needed. They could trace everything back to Paul. They started pulling on that thread, and the whole network started to unravel. This was no longer just a small operation. They now knew they were dealing with one of the most sophisticated criminal empires in the world. With Baraquatro's capture, Paul's empire began to crumble. His network was far-reaching, but it was now exposed. Every small detail that was missed led to more evidence for the authorities. And this one mistake was the beginning of the end. His downfall was way too close. September 26, 2012. Paul LaRue walked very normally into a hotel room in Monrovia, Liberia. He was thinking he was about to crack another big deal. He believed he was meeting people connected to a Colombian drug cartel to sell meth and weapons. What he didn't know was that the entire meeting was a trap. The people he was meeting weren't cartel members. They were undercover agents. The entire room was wired with hidden cameras, and DEA agents were waiting just outside. One of the men in the room was an old associate of Paul's who had turned informant and helped set up the sting. Paul sat down, calm and confident. He talked about how chaotic the place was, and how it was the perfect spot to do business quietly. But the moment the meeting ended, everything changed forever.
He's on the ground!
Liberian police, working with the DEA, stormed the room. Paul quickly shut his laptop, trying to protect the information on it. Then he tried to talk his way out of it. He yelled, argued, even tried to bribe them, but nothing worked. Paul LaRue was finally under arrest. At first, he resisted. When they tried to put him on a plane to the US, he went completely limp. The agents had to carry him onto the jet. But during the flight, something shifted. Paul started talking. No threats, no lawyers. He just had one request. Just promise me I don't die in jail. He waived his Miranda rights, signed off on searches of his devices, and began sharing everything. The DEA didn't need interrogation tactics. Paul LaRue was ready to deal. He gave them everything, access to his devices, passwords, and the full story behind his operation. By the time the plane landed in New York the next morning, Paul wasn't just another criminal. He was about to become one of the biggest informants the DEA had ever worked with. The mastermind had fallen, and now the real unraveling of his empire was about to begin. Over the next 2 years, LaRue continued running parts of his criminal operation under DEA supervision. But now, it was being used to set up and arrest others in his network. LaRue's cooperation did not mean that he didn't go to prison. In 2020, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. But here's the crazy question. Was Paul LaRue just one isolated case? Or is there a darker, digital underworld still growing, unnoticed? Are there others like him, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to strike? What do you think? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below.